The mahogany doors of the Davis boardroom felt like a box. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the metallic tang of Melia's own fear. "Sign it, Melia," her father whispered. Arthur Davis looked a decade older than he had a month ago. His hands trembled as he pushed the parchment toward her. "The Stevens family. They are the only ones who can liquidate the debt. If you don't, 3,000 employees lose their livelihoods. We lose everything." Melia looked across the table at Julian Stevens. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, leaning back with a smirk that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a trophy to break. He wanted the prestige of the Davis name, and he wanted Melia as the ultimate collateral. "One signature," Julian purred, his voice like silk over a blade, "and I'll wire the first 50 million. You'll be a Stevens by next month. Think of it as a corporate merger, darling. Nothing personal." Melia's stomach churned. She felt the trap closing around her. She picked up the pen, her knuckles white. "I am a sacrifice," she thought. "I am the price of my father's mistakes." With a jagged stroke, she signed. But as she stood up, she looked Julian dead in the eye. "I leave for 72 hours, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "A solo trip. No security, no phones, no Stevens. If you follow me, the deal is off, and I'll take my chances with bankruptcy." Julian laughed, a dry, mocking sound. "Go. Run. Get it out of your system. You have 3 days of freedom left, Melia. After that, you belong to me." Jeju Island was supposed to be a sanctuary, but as Melia stood on the rugged cliffs of the southern coast, the sky was turning a bruised, violent purple. The wind whipped her hair across her face, tasting of salt and impending chaos. She had checked into a remote villa under a false name, desperate to feel like a person rather than a line item on a balance sheet. She began to walk along the rocky shoreline, the roar of the ocean drowning out the screams of her own mind. She didn't notice how fast the tide was coming in. She didn't see the rogue wave until it was a wall of black water towering over her. The impact was a punch that knocked the breath from her lungs. The current dragged her down, her silk dress tangling around her legs like a shroud. Just as the darkness began to pull her under, a hand, strong, calloused, and unyielding, clamped onto her wrist. She was hauled upward, gasping, her lungs burning with brine. She was dumped onto the sand, coughing violently. Through the blur of rain and salt water, she saw him. He was kneeling over her, his expensive suit ruined, his white shirt clinging to a frame of pure muscle. He wasn't just a man. He was a force of nature. His face was a masterpiece of sharp angles and simmering intensity. "Are you trying to die, or are you just reckless?" His voice was a deep, melodic baritone that vibrated in her chest. This was Ju-chan Kim. Even in the middle of a storm, he radiated a terrifying level of power. I was just walking," Melia wheezed, shivering. Ju-chan didn't wait for an apology. He reached down, sliding one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. The pull was instantaneous. The heat from his body seared through her wet clothes, a physical shock that made her heart race for a reason that had nothing to do with the ocean. "The path is washed out," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. They were dark, piercing, and filled with an immediate predatory interest. "You're coming to my estate. I don't take no for an answer, especially from women who try to drown themselves on my property." Melia should have been afraid. She should have run. But as he carried her toward a waiting black SUV, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: life. For the first time since the debt began, the Stevens were a world away. There was only the storm, the island, and the man who held her like she was the most precious thing he had ever found. The estate was a fortress of glass and volcanic stone, perched precariously on a cliffside. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and expensive scotch. Ju-chan set Melia down in front of a roaring fireplace, tossing a heavy cashmere throw over her shivering shoulders. "Drink," he commanded, handing her a crystal glass of amber liquid. Melia took a sip, the heat blooming in her chest. She looked around at the priceless art and the panoramic view of the raging sea. Any other woman would have been asking for his name, his title, or a photo for social media. Melia just stared into the flames, her expression hollow. "You have the look of someone who lost a war," Ju-chan said, leaning against the mantel. He was watching her with the intensity of a hawk. "I didn't lose it," Melia replied, her voice low. "I surrendered to prevent more casualties." Ju-chan paused. He was used to the gold diggers of soul, women who memorized his net worth before meeting him. But this woman didn't care about his custom-tailored suit or the fact that his family's name was etched onto half the skyscrapers in the capital. She looked at him and saw only a man. It was the most intoxicating thing he had ever experienced. The next morning, the storm had cleared, leaving Jeju sparkling like a jewel. Melia tried to leave, but Ju-chan was waiting at the door. "You said you have 48 hours, Melia," he said, using the name she had given him. "Don't spend them in a dusty hotel. Spend them with me. I'll show you what it's like to actually be alive before you go back." The pull was magnetic. Over the next 2 days, Ju-chan pursued her with a ruthless, sophisticated charm. He didn't just show her wealth, he showed her intensity. He took her to a private cove where the water was so clear it looked like liquid diamonds. They dove into the waves, the physical proximity sending jolts of electricity through her. When they surfaced, he pinned her against a sun-warmed rock, his face inches from hers. "Why do you look at me like I'm a ghost?" he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Because in 2 days, I will be," Melia murmured to herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. That night, they sat on the terrace under a canopy of stars. Ju-chan dropped the CEO mask. He spoke about the crushing weight of his empire, the loneliness of the peak, and how he had never felt a punch to the gut, like the moment he pulled her from the water. "I've spent my life acquiring things," Ju-chan confessed, his voice dropping to a vulnerable growl. "Companies, land, power. But looking at you, I realize I've never actually owned a moment. Until now." Melia felt her defenses crumbling. She knew this was dangerous. She knew she was supposed to marry Julian Stevens in a matter of weeks. But here, in this forbidden paradise, she wasn't the sacrificial bride. She was a woman being worshipped by a king. "I can't give you forever, Ju-chan," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears she couldn't explain. "Then give me the next 24 hours, he replied, his hand sliding into her hair, pulling her toward him. "Give me everything you have left." The chemistry was no longer a spark. It was an inferno. Melia leaned in, her lips finally meeting his. It was a collision of desperation and desire. She decided, in that moment, to be dead to her real life. For the final night in Jeju, she would belong only to herself and to him. The moon hung low over the Jeju coastline, casting a silver path across the water that bled into the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ju-chan's bedroom. The air was heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the salt of the sea. Ju-chan stood by the window, his back to the room. He had never felt this frantic, gnawing need to hold on to something. "Come to Seoul with me," he said, his voice a low command, yet cracked with a rare plea. "I have houses, cars, a life that can be yours. I don't care who you were before yesterday. I'll clear your debts. I'll fight your wars. Just don't get on that plane." Melia stood in the shadows, her heart fracturing in her chest. If only he knew. If he tried to fight the Stevens, they would sink her father's company out of spite before Ju-chan could even sign a check. She was a signed contract. She was sold. "Tonight is all I have, Ju-chan," she whispered, stepping into the moonlight. "Make it count. Make me forget everything but you." She had spent 26 years guarding herself, waiting for a love that felt like a sanctuary. She never expected it to feel like a wildfire. When Ju-chan turned to her, the pull was violent. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands framing her face with a possessive ferocity. The intimacy was not just physical, it was soul deep. Every touch was a question, and every gasp was an answer. Melia gave herself to him with a desperation that bordered on worship. She wanted his touch branded into her skin so deeply that Julian Stevens could never truly touch her. As the clothes fell away and they merged in the heat of the silk sheets, the world narrowed down to the sound of their ragged breathing. Ju-chan moved with a surprising tenderness, sensing her hesitation, her trembling. When he finally breached the final barrier, he froze. He looked down at her, his dark eyes wide with shock, searching her tear-stained face. "Melia?" he breathed, his voice thick with realization. You were waiting?" "For you," she lied, and yet it was the only truth she had ever told. Always for you. The revelation changed everything for Ju-chan. He didn't just want her, he was now bonded to her. He loved her with a primal, protective fury. He spent the next few hours whispering promises of a future in Seoul, of a life where she would never have to be afraid again. Eventually, exhausted by the intensity of their union, Ju-chan fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. He lay with his arm draped possessively over her waist, a small, triumphant smile on his lips. In his mind, he was already calling his lawyers to prepare everything for a guest who would never leave. But Melia was wide awake. She watched the clock on the bedside table. 3:54 a.m. Every second felt like a drop of blood leaving her body. She carefully lifted his arm, her breath catching as he stirred but didn't wake. She stood up, her body aching with the beautiful memory of him, and dressed in the dark. She walked to his desk and grabbed a piece of stationery. Her hand shook as she wrote a name, Leah Moon, and a phone number that was 1 digit off from a disconnected line in a different country. She looked at him one last time. The man she loved. The man she was about to destroy. "I'm doing this to save my father," she told herself. "I'm doing this so you don't have to marry a woman who was already owned by another family." She stepped out into the 4 a.m. fog, the cold Jeju air hitting her like a slap. By the time the sun rose over the horizon, Melia was at the airport, her face masked by large sunglasses, boarding a flight back to the cage awaiting her in the United States. She left no trace, no DNA, nothing but the ghost of her scent on his sheets and a lie written in ink. The sun rose over Jeju with a cruel brilliance, flooding the bedroom with light. Ju-chan reached out instinctively, his hands searching for the warmth of Melia's skin, but he found only cold, empty silk. He bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Melia?" Silence. The house was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic crash of the waves against the cliffs below. He lunged out of bed, checking the bathroom, the terrace, the kitchen. Nothing. His eyes fell on the desk. A small slip of paper sat there, mocking him. Leah Moon. He called the number immediately. "The number you have dialed is not in service." The truth hit him then. A cold, hollow realization. He called his head of security, his voice a jagged blade of authority. "I want a lock on the island. Check the flight manifest for the last 4 hours. Find a woman named Leah Moon. Wait, no. Find the woman who was with me. Look for her face. Use the thermal logs from the gate. Find her." By noon, his lead investigator stood before him, head bowed. Sir, the name is a dead end. The number is a ghost. The security cameras at the airport show a woman matching her description, but she used a high-level encrypted passport. She's gone. She didn't just leave Ju-chan. She erased herself. Ju-chan smashed a crystal glass against the wall. He had been a king his whole life, but for the first time, he was powerless. He sat in the dark of his study, his obsession sinking in. He didn't know her real name, but he knew the soul of the woman he had held. He wouldn't stop until he found the ghost who stole his heart. Across the ocean in New York, the air was gray and suffocating. Melia sat in the back of a black town car, her body feeling heavy, her spirit fractured. The Stevens-Davis merger gala was only weeks away. Julian Stevens met her at her father's estate, his eyes scanning her with a proprietary greed. "You're late, Melia, and you look different. Did you have your fun in the sun?" He reached out to touch her cheek, and Melia flinched. The memory of Ju-chan's tender touch was so fresh that Julian's hand felt like a burn. "Don't touch me," she snapped. 6 weeks later, the world tilted on its axis. Melia stood in her bathroom, staring at the digital readout of a pregnancy test. Pregnant. The room spun. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this child belonged to the man on the island. He was the only one. He was her first and only. "I'm not marrying him," Melia announced that evening. Her father, Arthur, dropped his glass. Julian, who was visiting to discuss the wedding guest list, stood up slowly, his face contorting into a mask of pure malice. "You signed a contract, Melia," Julian hissed. "If you back out now, I will call in every debt. I will buy your father's banknotes and burn this house to the ground by Monday." "Then start the fire," Melia said, her voice shaking but resolute, "because I will not bring a child into a home with a man like you." The silence that followed was deafening. Julian looked at her flat stomach, his eyes narrowing. "A child? You went to Jeju and came back a whore?" The insult was the final blow. Arthur Davis gasped, clutching his chest, and collapsed onto the Persian rug. The following days were a blur of hospital corridors and flashing cameras. Her father had suffered a massive stroke, leaving him paralyzed and unable to speak. The Stevens family followed through on their threat. They pulled their funding, launched a smear campaign in the press, and began a predatory short sale of Davis Corp stock. Melia stood in her father's office, looking at the city skyline. She was alone. She was pregnant. Her family legacy was under siege. She rubbed her stomach, a silent vow forming in her mind. "I will save this company. I will protect you. And your father, he can never know. To him, I am a ghost. To the world, I am a warrior." She picked up the phone and called the board of directors. "This is Melia Davis. My father is incapacitated. As of this moment, I am acting CEO. Prepare for war." The boardroom of Kim Industries in Seoul was a glacier. Ju-chan sat at the head of the table, his eyes colder than the winter air outside. Weeks had passed since Jeju, and the ghost had become a phantom limb, a pain he felt every day but couldn't touch. "The merger with the Han Group is dependent on a family alliance," his uncle, the chairman, insisted. "The public is tired of your bachelor antics, Ju-chan. You need stability. You need a wife." Ju-chan looked at the profile of Seo Yeon-han, the poised, perfect daughter of his biggest rival. She was a beautiful statue. She wasn't a girl who laughed in the rain or looked at him with eyes that saw the man instead of the money. "Fine," Ju-chan said, standing up. "Draft the contract, but tell her not to expect a heart. Mine was stolen by a ghost." The wedding was the social event of the decade in Korea, but for Ju-chan, it was a funeral. The marriage lasted exactly 7 months. It was a disaster of silence and resentment. Ju-chan was never home. He spent his nights in his office or flying to Jeju, sitting on the same cliff where he had rescued Melia, staring at the horizon. Seo-yeon eventually confronted him in their cold marble foyer. You aren't even here, Ju-chan. You look at me and you see someone else. Who is she? Who is the woman who ruined you for everyone else? Someone who doesn't exist, Ju-chan replied, his voice a jagged edge. They divorced quietly. The board was furious, the press was scandalous, and Ju-chan became even more ruthless, burying his heartbreak under a mountain of hostile takeovers. He became a king of shadows, his wealth multiplying tenfold, but his soul remaining empty. Across the Atlantic, in a quiet, high-security wing of a New York hospital, a different kind of life was beginning. Melia gripped the hospital railings, her face slick with sweat. She had spent 9 months hiding her growing belly from the Stevens private investigators and fighting off their legal vultures. She had managed to secure a private loan from an old family friend to keep the company's doors open, but the stress had been a knock to her health. Then, the first cry filled the room. The nurse cleaned the baby and handed him to Melia. She gasped, the breath leaving her lungs in a sharp sob. The boy didn't look like her. He had a shock of thick black hair, a defiant set to his jaw even in infancy, and eyes that, when they finally opened, were the exact piercing shape of the man from the island. Jisoo, she whispered, kissing his forehead. Your name is Jisoo. As the months turned into years, Jisoo grew into a miniature version of the Korean CEO. He was brilliant, focused, and possessed a boldness that terrified Melia. He would look at her with those dark, knowing eyes, and for a second, she was back in the villa in Jeju, feeling the heat of Ju-chan's gaze. She worked 18-hour days, turning Davis Corp into a boutique powerhouse. She became the Iron Lady of New York finance, all while keeping Jisoo hidden in a world of private tutors and high-fenced estates. The Stevens family never stopped circling. Julian Stevens, bitter and humiliated by the canceled wedding, spent a decade trying to find the weakness in Melia's armor. He knew there was a child. He just couldn't prove who the father was. Melia looked at a photo of Ju-chan she had found in an international business magazine. He looked older, harder, and impossibly powerful. He's your father, Jisoo, she whispered to the empty room. But he can never know, because if he finds us, he'll take you. And if the Stevens find out, they'll destroy us both. The edges of her secret were growing sharper. She was holding a tiger by the tail, and she knew that one day the tiger would turn around. 10 years had transformed the sacrificial bride into a woman of steel. Melia Davis stood in her penthouse office overlooking Manhattan, her reflection in the glass showing a woman who wore her power like armor. Her hair was pulled back in a sharp professional bob, and her suits were tailored to perfection. But the teeth of the Stevens family were finally sinking in deep. They've bought 40% of the float, Melia, her CFO said, his voice trembling. Julian Stevens has been hoarding shares for a decade. He's triggered a hostile takeover bid. If we don't find a massive capital infusion or a strategic partner by the end of the month, Davis Corp is dead. And Julian? He's already bragging that he'll turn your father's building into a parking lot. Melia's eyes narrowed. Julian hadn't just wanted the company. He wanted to see her on her knees for the humiliation of 10 years ago. There is one option, she said, her heart hammering a rhythm of dread. The K-Tech Summit in Seoul. The Kim Group is looking for a Western logistics partner to bridge their AI expansion. If we secure that contract, the Stevens won't just be stopped. They'll be crushed by the sheer weight of the Kim name. Seoul? The CFO blinked. You've avoided the entire Asian market for 10 years. You've never even sent a deputy there. Because I was afraid, Melia whispered to the window, but I'm more afraid of losing my father's legacy to a man like Julian. Mom? Are we really going to the place where the spicy crackers come from? Melia turned, her face softening instantly. Jisoo stood in the doorway, clutching a tablet. At 8 years old, he was a terrifyingly bright child. He had his father's height, his father's authoritative stance, and that same piercing, punch-to-the-gut gaze. Yes, Jisoo, it's a business trip, but it's also a holiday for you. Will I see where you went that summer? He asked. Melia froze. She had told him very little about Jeju, only that it was a beautiful island where she once found peace. Maybe, she lied, her chest aching, but we have to stay in the city. We have to be very careful. She knew the risk. Seoul was Ju-chan's kingdom. Every billboard, every second skyscraper, and every news cycle bore his name. But she gambled on the fact that he was a busy man who moved in circles far above a visiting American CEO. She would get in, sign the deal, and get out. Landing at Incheon Airport felt like stepping back into a dream that had turned into a nightmare. The air, the language, the very scent of the city triggered memories of Ju-chan's hands, his voice, and the night they shared. For 2 weeks, Melia worked like a woman possessed. She stayed in a quiet boutique hotel far from the Gangnam district where Ju-chan's headquarters sat. She kept Jisoo with a trusted nanny, only taking him out to quiet parks during the day. She was winning. The K-Tech board was impressed. The contract was drafted. The Stevens were panicking back in New York, their lawyers unable to touch her while she was under the protection of Korean trade law. One more day, she whispered to herself as she packed her bags for their departure. Just get through the airport, and we are safe forever. But fate has a way of showing up when you think you've escaped. On the morning of their flight, a massive data leak at Kim Industries sent the city into a frenzy. Ju-chan Kim, now 10 times more powerful and infinitely more ruthless, was forced to cancel his private flight to New York for a summit to handle a security breach. He was delayed. He was furious. And he was heading to Incheon to catch the only available business class seat on a commercial flight to save a billion-dollar merger. The collision was no longer a possibility. It was a countdown. Tari, the atmosphere in the business class cabin of Flight KR-102 was hushed and sterile. Melia buckled Jisoo into his seat, her hands trembling slightly. Just 14 hours, sweetie. Then we're home. We're safe. Jisoo looked up from his book, his dark, intelligent eyes scanning his mother's face. You're doing the worry line thing again, Mom. The bad men in New York can't find us here. Melia forced a smile, smoothing his hair. Hair that was the exact shade of midnight black she had tried to forget for a decade. I know, I'm just tired. Suddenly, the cabin air seemed to thin. A ripple of nervous energy swept through the flight attendants. A man was walking down the aisle, flanked by 2 stone-faced men in dark suits. He wasn't just walking. He was reclaiming the space around him. Ju-chan was furious. A mechanical failure on his private jet was an insult. Being forced to fly commercial, even in business class, was a waste of his time. He was checking a document on his phone, his jaw set in a line of granite. Then he looked up. The world didn't just stop. It shattered. 10 years of bitterness, 10 years of searching for a ghost named Leah Moon, and 10 years of a cold, empty heart came crashing into the present. Melia was staring at him, her face turning a ghostly, translucent white. She looked more beautiful than the girl on the cliffs, more seasoned, more regal, but the eyes were the same. The eyes that had lied to him. Ju-chan's gaze dropped. Next to her sat a boy. The child was looking at him with a curious, fearless expression. Ju-chan felt a punch to his soul that knocked the oxygen out of his lungs. He wasn't looking at a stranger. He was looking into a mirror. The boy had his brow, his defiant mouth, and eyes that were an unmistakable, haunting match for his own. Sir, please take your seat. We are beginning to taxi, a flight attendant whispered, terrified by the look on Ju-chan's face. Ju-chan didn't move. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a caged beast. The intensity of his rage and his longing were tearing at him. Melia grabbed Jisoo's hand, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. The plane began to lurch forward, moving toward the runway. Ju-chan didn't look at the attendant. He reached out and snatched the cabin interphone from the bulkhead wall. His voice wasn't a request. It was the roar of a god. "This is Ju-chan Kim," he growled into the receiver, his eyes locked onto Melia's terrified ones. "I don't care who was on the runway. I don't care about the FAA. Stop this plane, now. Sir, we can't." "I own 30% of this airline's holding company," Ju-chan barked, his power radiating off him in waves. "Turn this aircraft around and return to the gate, or I will liquidate every asset this carrier owns by sunset. Stop the plane." The engines whined as the pilot slammed on the brakes. Passengers gasped as the aircraft jerked to a violent halt. Outside, the blue and red lights of airport security began to flash, responding to the emergency halt. The cabin was silent, save for the sound of Melia's frantic breathing. Ju-chan stepped closer, looming over her seat. He ignored the whispers of the other passengers. 10 years, he hissed, his voice a low, vibrating chord of pain and fury. 10 years I looked for a ghost, and here you are, sitting on a plane in Seoul. "Ju-chan, please," Melia whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't do this here. Don't frighten him." Ju-chan looked at Jisoo. The boy didn't look frightened. He looked intrigued. He was studying Ju-chan with a familiar, analytical intensity. "What's your name, kid?" Ju-chan asked, his voice softening just a fraction, though his eyes remained lethal. "Jisoo Davis," the boy replied firmly. "Are you the man who stopped the plane? That's against the rules." A dark, jagged smile touched Ju-chan's lips. "I make the rules, Jisoo." He turned back to Melia, his expression hardening into a mask of absolute possession. "Get up. You aren't going to New York. You aren't going anywhere ever again until I get the truth. I have a company to run. The Stevens are nothing," Ju-chan roared, his voice echoing through the cabin. "You are coming with me, now, or I will have the police remove you in handcuffs for child endangerment and fraud. Choose, Melia, or Leah, or whoever the hell you are today." Melia looked at Jisoo, then at the man she had never stopped loving, the man who now looked ready to burn the world down to keep her. She stood up. The explosive reunion had begun. The hunter had finally caught his ghost. The private VIP terminal was a tomb of glass and polished marble, stripped of the airport's usual chaos. Outside, armored SUVs idled on the tarmac, their headlights cutting through the dusk. Inside, Ju-chan stood by the window, his back to Melia, his silhouette sharp enough to draw blood. He dismissed his guards with a sharp flick of his wrist. Only the three of them remained. "Sit," Ju-chan commanded. It wasn't an invitation. Melia sat on the edge of a velvet armchair, her hand clutched tightly in Jisoo's. The intensity of Ju-chan's presence was even more overwhelming in the small space. He turned around, his eyes raking over her, looking for the girl from Jeju and finding a woman who looked like she'd been through a war. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "The manifest says Melia Davis, CEO of Davis Corp. The woman I knew was Leah Moon, a tourist with a fake number." "I did what I had to do, Ju-chan," Melia said, her voice trembling but her gaze holding his. "You were a stranger. I had a life waiting for me, a debt, a family." "You had me," he snarled, stepping into her space. "I offered you the world. I would have paid your debts in blood if you had asked. Instead, you vanished. You let me wake up in an empty bed like a fool." Ju-chan's gaze shifted to the boy. Jisoo was sitting perfectly still, watching the exchange with a chillingly familiar calmness. He wasn't crying. He was observing. And him? Ju-chan's voice dropped to a whisper. The question bared. Who is his father, Melia? Is he the reason you ran? To go back to another man? Melia's heart stopped. She opened her mouth to tell the lie she had practiced for a decade, that he was Julian's, that he was the result of a different life. His father is a businessman in New York. He isn't. Mom, why are you lying? The voice was small but clear. Jisoo looked up at Ju-chan. You're the man from the photo in the drawer, aren't you? The one she looks at when she thinks I'm sleeping. Ju-chan froze. The shock hit him squarely in the chest. A photo? Jisoo, be quiet, Melia pleaded, but it was too late. Jisoo looked at Ju-chan's towering frame. I'm 8 years old, sir. My birthday is in May. I'm at the top of my class in math. My mom told me she didn't meet anyone else after coming back from the Magic Island. 8 years old. May. The date slammed into Ju-chan's mind like a freight train. 10 years since Jeju. 9 months for a pregnancy. 8 years of a life. Ju-chan staggered back, hitting the edge of a desk. The realization was a physical agony. He hadn't just lost a woman he loved for a weekend. He had been robbed of the birth, the first steps, the first words, and 8 years of his own son's life. 8 years, Ju-chan breathed, his eyes turning a violent, shimmering red. He looked at Melia, and for a moment, the love was completely eclipsed by a terrifying rage. You stole him from me. I was protecting him, Melia screamed, finally breaking. She stood up, shielding Jisoo. The Stevens would have killed the company. I was a single woman with a child in a corporate world that wanted to eat me alive. What was I supposed to do? Call the billionaire I knew for 3 days and tell him I was carrying his heir? Yes, Ju-chan roared, slamming his fist onto the marble table, cracking the surface. You should have called. I would have burned New York to the ground to get to you. I spent 7 months in a marriage that felt like a prison because I couldn't find you. I have lived like a machine for 10 years. He lunged forward, grabbing Melia's shoulders. Not with violence, but with a desperate, crushing possession. He is a Kim, Ju-chan hissed, his forehead dropping to hers. He has my blood. He has my eyes. And you are the woman who broke me. He looked at Jisoo, then back to Melia, his expression hardening into something cold and permanent. The plane isn't taking off, Melia. Not today. Not ever. You wanted to run Davis Corp? Fine. You can run it from my penthouse, because from this second on, neither of you leaves my sight. I've lost 10 years. I won't lose another minute. The golden cage was locking. Melia looked into the eyes of the man she loved and saw a stranger who was now 10 times more powerful and 10 times more dangerous. The penthouse was a fortress of glass, steel, and suffocating luxury atop the Kim Empire Tower. It was a golden cage that overlooked the neon veins of Seoul. Ju-chan didn't just move them in. He erased their ability to leave. Their luggage was brought from the airport, and a staff of 20 stood ready to fulfill every whim or block every exit. Ju-chan stood at the bar, swirling a glass of neat bourbon. He watched Melia through the reflection in the window. She was standing in the center of the living room, looking like a captured queen, defiant, exhausted, and hauntingly beautiful. This is kidnapping, Ju-chan, she said, her voice echoing in the vast space. This is family reunification, he replied, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He walked toward her, his presence filling the room. He stopped just inches away, the heat from his body radiating against hers. I am a man who lost a decade. I am simply making up for lost time. Ju-chan was torn. Half of him wanted to punish her for every night he had spent staring at the Jeju horizon, while the other half wanted to sink to his knees and beg her never to leave again. He chose a different path, Reseduction through power. Over the next few days, he didn't force himself on her. Instead, he surrounded her with the weight of his influence. He arranged for the finest chefs to prepare the specific New York dishes she missed. He had a world-class wardrobe delivered to her, filled with her favorite designers. In the evenings, they sat across from each other at a dining table long enough to be a runway. "Tell me why you really left," he said one night, his eyes drilling into hers. "And don't give me the stranger excuse. We both know what happened in that bed in Jeju wasn't a meeting of strangers." Melia felt the pull of the memory. "I was terrified, Ju-chan. My father was dying. The Stevens family was a pack of wolves. I thought if I told you, I'd just be trading one master for another. I wanted to be free." Ju-chan leaned in, his hand grazing hers on the table, a touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "Look at me, Melia. Am I a master, or am I the only man who ever truly saw you?" While the air between Ju-chan and Melia was thick with unresolved tension, the relationship between Ju-chan and Jisoo was a revelation. Ju-chan, a man who had no warmth for anyone but a ghost, found himself utterly captivated by the 8-year-old. Jisoo didn't fear his father's power. He analyzed it. One afternoon, Ju-chan found Jisoo in the library, looking at a complex holographic display of the Kim Group's logistics chain. "The efficiency in the southeast sector is lagging by 4%, Jisoo said without looking up. "The port strikes in Thailand weren't factored into the AI's predictive model." Ju-chan froze. He walked over, looking at his son, the boy who had his face and, apparently, his predatory business mind. "And how would you fix it, Jisoo?" "I'd reroute through Vietnam and use the rail backup," the boy said, finally looking up with a small, proud smile. "That's what Mom would do. She says dead time is dead money." Ju-chan felt a surge of pride so intense it actually hurt. He sat down next to his son, and for the first time in 10 years, he laughed. It wasn't the cold laugh of a CEO. It was the laugh of a father. He began to teach Jisoo the basis of the industry, and in return, Jisoo began to melt the ice around Ju-chan's heart. But the piece was a fragile glass. Late that night, Melia's phone, which Ju-chan had finally returned, glowed with a frantic message from New York. "Unknown sender. I know where you are, Melia. I know about the boy. The Kim secret won't save you. I'm coming to take back what's mine. JS." Melia looked at Ju-chan, who was standing on the balcony looking out at his kingdom. She realized the Stevens weren't just a threat to her company anymore. They were a threat to the family she was only just beginning to find. The sleek, minimalist lobby of the Shilla Soul was a temple of quiet wealth, but Julian Stevens entered it like a wrecking ball. He felt invincible. He had tracked Melia's tail for 10 years, and he finally had what he needed to tear her life apart. He didn't go to her office. He didn't call her lawyers. He sent a single, high-resolution image to Melia's private phone, a grainy but unmistakable shot of her leaving a New York pediatric clinic years ago with a baby, followed by a photo of Jisoo in Seoul. The text read, "Meet me in the hotel lounge in 30 minutes. Alone. Or the secret heir of Davis Corp becomes the front-page scandal of every tabloid from Manhattan to Seoul." Melia arrived, her face a mask of cold fury. She found Julian sitting in a secluded corner, sipping a martini, looking as predatory as the day she signed the contract. "You look well, Melia," Julian sneered, sliding a tablet across the table. It was filled with dossiers on Jisoo. "The Iron Lady has a soft spot. A bastard son. Imagine what the Davis Corp board and my family's lawyers will do when I prove you broke our marriage contract because you were carrying another man's child. I'll sue for every cent you've made in the last decade. I'll take the company, and I'll leave you and the boy on the street." "You're a monster, Julian," Melia whispered, her hands shaking under the table. "I'm a businessman. he corrected. Sign over your remaining shares of Davis Corp to me today, and I'll bury the photos. If not, the scandal breaks in 1 hour. Melia looked at him, a strange, chilling calm settling over her. You think I'm alone, don't you? You think you're the biggest shark in this ocean. In this city? You're just a tourist with a secret, Julian laughed. Actually, a voice like grinding stones interrupted from behind him. She is the guest of the king, and you are trespassing. Julian's laughter died in his throat. He turned to see Ju-chan Kim standing there. Ju-chan wasn't wearing a suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the powerful forearms of a man who didn't mind getting his hands dirty. Behind him stood 6 security guards, their presence so intimidating the other guests in the lounge began to flee. Ju-chan didn't sit. He leaned over the table, his shadow engulfing Julian. Julian Stevens, Ju-chan said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. I've spent the last hour reviewing your family's portfolio. You have a lot of debt tied up in shipping lanes and Asian semiconductor chips. Specifically, chips manufactured by my subsidiaries. Who the hell are you? Julian stammered, though the punch of Ju-chan's aura was already making him sweat. Ju-chan reached out, picked up Julian's martini, and poured it slowly onto the floor. I am the man whose son you just threatened. I am the man who has been waiting 10 years to find a reason to destroy the people who made Melia run from me. Ju-chan leaned in closer. You have 2 choices. You can delete those files and leave Korea on a cargo ship tonight, or I can make sure that by tomorrow morning, the Stevens family doesn't own enough capital to buy a cup of coffee. I don't just have money, Julian. I have sovereignty. Julian looked at the guards, then at the sheer, murderous intent in Ju-chan's eyes. He realized his mistake. He had brought a knife to a nuclear standoff. This isn't over, Julian hissed, reaching for his tablet. Ju-chan's hand moved like lightning, pinning Julian's wrist to the table with a sickening crack. It was over the second you touched my soil, Ju-chan whispered. Security, escort Mr. Stevens to the basement. I believe we need to discuss his exit strategy in a more private setting. As Julian was dragged away, screaming about lawyers and international law, Ju-chan turned to Melia. The rage vanished, replaced by an intense, burning protectiveness. Is the boy safe? He asked. He's at the penthouse with the nanny, Melia breathed, the adrenaline finally leaving her. Ju-chan pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the lounge. The Stevens are done, Melia. I'm not just protecting the company. I'm hunting them. By the time I'm finished, there won't be a Stevens name left for them to inherit. The war had started, but it was already one-sided. Ju-chan was no longer just a CEO. He was a warlord protecting his own. The grand ballroom of the Lotte Hotel was a sea of black ties, diamonds, and the sharp scent of ambition. It was the annual Global Tech Gala, the very stage where Julian Stevens planned to deliver the punch that would end Davis Corp. Despite the confrontation at the Shilla, Julian had doubled down. He believed Ju-chan was bluffing about the extent of his reach. He had leaked a teaser to the press about an American CEO's illegitimate child. And now, standing on the gala floor, he held a microphone, ready to address the elite of the business world. Before we toast to progress, Julian announced, his voice amplified and oily, perhaps we should look at the integrity of our partners. Melia Davis, CEO of Davis Corp, has built a brand on family values while hiding a decade-long scandal. A child born of a nameless affair, a breach of our merger contract that has cost my family millions. Is this who we want leading our industry? A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras turned toward Melia, who stood near the stage. She looked pale but regal in a gown of midnight velvet. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. The sound was like a thunderclap, silencing the room. Ju-chan Kim walked in. He wasn't alone. He was holding the hand of an 8-year-old boy in a miniature tailored tuxedo. Jisoo walked with the same confident, measured stride as his father, his chin held high. Ju-chan didn't walk to the bar or a table. He walked straight onto the stage, physically crowding Julian out of the spotlight, his voice commanding the room. "You speak of nameless affairs, Mr. Stevens," Ju-chan said, the chill in his smile sending a visible shiver through the audience. "But you are mistaken. The child you are so obsessed with is a Kim. He is my son, my only heir. And the woman you've spent 10 years harassing is my fiancé." The shock was so absolute that the room went dead silent. The press scrambled, their flashes turning the room into a strobe light of chaos. Ju-chan turned to the projection screen behind them. With a flick of his phone, he replaced the scandalous photos Julian had prepared with a series of bank transfers and debt acquisition documents. "In the last 48 hours, Ju-chan continued, his voice cold and precise, the Kim Group has purchased every outstanding bond, every mortgage, and every line of credit tied to the Stevens family holdings. You came here to sink Davis Corp, Julian, but you didn't realize that I now own the very air you breathe." Ju-chan stepped closer to a trembling Julian, his presence a wall of pure power. "You aren't a rival anymore. You are a subordinate. And as your primary creditor, I am calling in all debts. Effective immediately, the Stevens Group is in receivership. You are finished." Julian collapsed into a chair, the microphone dropping from his hand with a piercing screech. He had come to execute a company. Instead, his entire dynasty had been erased in a single sentence. Ju-chan stepped off the stage and walked directly to Melia. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, but his eyes never left hers. "I told you I would fight your wars," he whispered. He then picked up Jisoo, hoisting the boy onto his shoulder so the entire world could see the next king of the Kim Empire. The Davis name is safe, because today it joins mine. The applause was deafening. The Stevens were being ushered out by security, becoming nothing more than a footnote in history. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of international headlines, but for Melia and Ju-chan, the noise of the world had finally faded. They stood on the private terrace of the Kim penthouse, the cool night air of Seoul finally bringing a moment of clarity. "You didn't have to do that," Melia whispered, looking at the city lights. "You didn't have to buy a dynasty just to save me." "I didn't do it to save your company, Melia. I did it because for 10 years, I've had a hole in my life the size of a galaxy," Ju-chan replied, turning her to face him. His eyes weren't those of a CEO anymore. They were the eyes of the man who had pulled her from the waves. "Now, tell me the truth. No more lies. No more Leah Moon. Why did you run from me that morning?" The whole truth finally came out. Melia's voice broke as she poured out a decade of buried pain. "What happened between us and Jeju didn't feel like two strangers meeting. I wanted to stay, to go with you to Seoul. I saw the way you looked at me, like I was home, and I felt that way too. No man has ever made me feel that way. But I was already a signed piece of property, Ju-chan. My father's life, his company, the livelihoods of thousands. It was all tied to a contract that said I belonged to Julian Stevens. When I met you, I was already sold. I thought if I stayed, Julian would use his connections to ruin you too. I thought your world had no space for me, that I was just a girl with a shadow hanging over her. I didn't want to be your burden. I didn't want you to see me as a project to be fixed." Ju-chan listened, his jaw tightening with every word. When she finished, he didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a fierce, burning regret. "You thought I saw a project?" he growled, stepping closer until their breaths mingled. "Melia, if you had told me that morning, I would have bought Davis Corp 10 times over before breakfast. I would have dismantled the Stevens family a decade ago. I didn't love you because of what you could offer. I loved you because you were the only person who looked at me and didn't see a bank account." He brushed a tear from her cheek. You didn't protect me by leaving. You punished us both. The next day, they didn't go to New York or the Kim headquarters. They took a private helicopter to Jeju. The island was just as it had been 10 years ago, lush, wild, and smelling of salt and jasmine. They walked down the rugged path to the same cliffside where the storm had once brought them together. Jisoo was with them, running ahead to explore the tide pools, his laughter echoing against the stone. They reached the spot where Ju-chan had first pulled her from the water. The sea was calm today, a brilliant turquoise that matched the peace in Melia's heart. Ju-chan stopped and turned to her. He didn't reach for a checkbook or a contract. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring, a flawless, deep blue sapphire surrounded by diamonds, reflecting the color of the Jeju Sea. He didn't stand tall like a king this time. He knelt on the volcanic rock, his pride completely gone. 10 years ago, I asked you to come to Seoul because I wanted to possess the woman who intrigued me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But today, I'm not asking as a CEO, or a billionaire, or a savior. I'm asking as a man who has finally found his home. He looked up at her, his soul bared. Melia Davis, you are the mother of my son and the only woman who ever made my heart beat. I've waited 3,650 days to say this. Don't just stay for the company. Don't stay for the protection. Stay because you love me as much as I love you. Will you marry me? Melia looked at the man she had dreamed of every night for a decade. She looked at Jisoo, who was watching from the shoreline with a wide, knowing grin. The pull was finally complete. Yes, she sobbed, throwing her arms around his neck. 1,000 times. Yes. As they kissed, the sun began to set over the Jeju horizon, turning the world gold. The sacrificial bride was gone. In her place stood a queen, finally standing beside her king, with a future that no contract could ever break. 3 years later, the skyline of Manhattan looked different tonight. Atop the Davis-Kim International Tower, the result of a historic merger that had sent shockwaves through the global markets. The penthouse lights glowed with a warmth that had nothing to do with corporate success. Melia sat at her desk, finishing a memo. She was no longer the woman drowning in duty. She was the co-architect of a global empire. But as the door to her office creaked open, she didn't look up at a secretary or an assistant. The helicopter is on the roof, Melia, Ju-chan said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked more relaxed than he ever had in his 30s, the sharp edges of his personality softened by the presence of his family, though the chill was still there for anyone who dared cross his wife. If we don't leave now, we'll miss the sunset over the Han River. Jisoo is already complaining about our inefficiency. Melia laughed, standing up and smoothing her silk dress. The boy is exactly like you. He thinks a 3-minute delay is a fiscal catastrophe. As they ascended toward the roof, they passed the junior executive floor. There, at the head of a small conference table in the Young Innovators Wing, sat 11-year-old Jisoo. He wasn't playing games. He was sitting with 3 of the company's lead engineers, reviewing the logistics for their new sustainable energy plant in Jeju. The carbon offset is impressive, Jisoo was saying, his voice a perfect mimic of Ju-chan's authoritative baritone. But if we don't secure the local fishing rights first, the community impact will create a PR liability in Q3. Revise the proposal and have it on my desk. Well, my dad's desk, by Monday. Ju-chan caught his son's eye through the glass. He gave a single, sharp nod of approval. Jisoo winked back before returning to his board. He's going to run the world before he's 20, Melia whispered as they stepped onto the helipad. He's a Kim, Ju-chan replied, pulling her close as the rotor blades began to hum. And a Davis. He never stood a chance at being ordinary. The flight to Seoul was a familiar bridge now. They lived between 2 worlds, having turned their trauma into a legacy. The Stevens family was a distant memory. Julian was reportedly working a mid-level desk job in a firm Ju-chan secretly owned, just to ensure he stayed under a watchful eye. As the jet leveled out over the Pacific, Ju-chan pulled a small, leather-bound book from his pocket. It was a diary Melia had started, a record of all the days they had missed during those 10 years. "I found a new entry for today," Ju-chan said, his voice dropping to that intimate, pull-and-punch register that still made Melia's heart race. "Oh?" It says, "Today, the ghost finally stopped running." Melia leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out at the vast, endless horizon. The island of Jeju was somewhere beneath the clouds, the place where a desperate girl and a lonely king had collided. "I didn't stop running, Ju-chan," she corrected him softly, turning to kiss him. "I just finally realized I was running toward you the whole time." Ju-chan tightened his grip on her hand, the sapphire on her finger catching the light of the rising sun. They weren't just a business merger or a tabloid headline. They were the proof that even after a decade of silence, the heart always remembers the way home. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. Drop a comment below. What moment stood out to you the most? And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.